Shifting a little bit now to matters pertaining to South Africa, we'll obviously continue with the fallout for the Republicans and the Democrats, and then implications for the US's relationship with countries like China, with the European Union, etc. But I just want to shift the conversation slightly, and Herman, I'm going to stick with you. So our next two slides, we just wanted to present to you the difference and the nuances between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration in terms of aid flow to Africa from the US. And you can see a steady increase from 2019. So before COVID, this occurring during Trump's first presidency. And then secondly, if you look at South Africa-US trade relations. So you can see an element of predictability and consistency in the first Trump administration. South African exports to the US, your red bars, and South African imports from the US in the orange bars, versus a shift, maybe a bit more fluctuation and uncertainty under the Biden administration. Now, of course, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that messes with one's maybe predictions as geopolitics, which is indeed the quintessential man-made uncertainty tends to do. But Herman, just sticking with you around specifically aid flows and US-South Africa trade relations, asking you to take out your crystal ball and predict how it's going to look under Trump too.
Yes. So I think with trade flows, you do get that deviation from what seemed to be a downward trajectory under the Trump administration from 2017. You get that escalation during COVID, and that is probably explained by the unique circumstances of government stepping in to support locally, but also your larger countries stepping in to bear a lot of the brunt, with the IMF also and the World Bank trying to secure the necessary funds amidst the global lockdown, and just the economic consequences of that. So I do think that is part of that reversal. But you also see in the Biden years that increase of aid to South Africa. You do see something closer to the foreign policy consensus that pretty much defined the latter half of the 20th century, and going even as late as Barack Obama before Trump, where there was this idea that America had a moral obligation to increase its aid spending. And that was part of the typical internationalist argument that had, in the 20th century at least, come predominantly from the left. But the Trump term obviously saw that decline, and that makes complete sense within the somewhat isolationist and protectionist view that Trump takes of the world. It is very much a charity begins at home approach with him. You can see that from his foreign policy decisions in terms of what he has said about withdrawing from foreign military contests, the possibility of trying to de-escalate tensions in unlikely places like North Korea. You see it with his economic policy and his trade policy, willing to put up trade barriers, willing to use protectionist mechanisms to ensure that America first gets manifested in terms of the socioeconomic outworkings, at least in the short term, of his policy. Now, the trade issue is quite interesting in the sense that we do see a picture here of stability versus instability, and that might be unfair to the Biden administration. But you do want, as a business, dependent on exports and imports, you do want consistency. And if we look at that consistency on South African export to the US, 2017, 2018, 2019, even with 2020 accompanying, appreciating the economic changes that had already kicked in, you see what businesses like to see. The ability to plan ahead in terms of how you can ensure you manage your own resources to meet the demand in an external market. And those expectations remained consistent and solid. The same with imports. Now, there are two parts to this issue that need unpacking. Number one is there was trade stability under Trump. The data shows it. So there is a possibility of returning to that type of trade stability that we didn't see during Biden. However, then one might say, but that's not fair, because the Ukrainian conflict triggered by the Russian invasion was partly what drove up this shakeup, especially with the Ukrainian economy and the South African economy producing at least similar export products in terms of iron, steel, and agricultural produce, nuts, vegetables, and fruit, where those Ukrainian products suddenly became scarce globally just because of the interruption of supply chains there. South Africa was able to pick up the slack, and that is what stood us in good stead in making sure that our exports to the US could accompany that. And yet it is worth pointing out that Vladimir Putin did not invade Ukraine under Donald Trump, nor did he act on the Crimea under Donald Trump, nor was the invasion of Georgia an occurrence that happened under Donald Trump. So you can draw a parallel between the unpredictability of Trump on foreign policy, his willingness and perceived willingness to escalate and use the nuclear option, and the same sort of unpredictability and consequential fear and caution that was associated with the Reagan strategy towards the end of the Cold War. Reagan was also seen as a loose cannon, someone who could at any moment ignite the fire keg of the Cold War, and yet it served him in good stead, allowing the James Bakers of the world to, in the next presidency, make use of that caution that had slowed down the geopolitical divisions in America's favor, just simply because you never knew whether things were going actually to escalate. So Donald Trump might have a similar effect on that. It might, his unpredictability might become a global certainty, more respected or more appreciated or more factored in by a more proactive negative actors than the so-called foreign policy stability view that Biden and Obama and Harris quite clearly wanted to push. So the question on whether trade relations between the US and South Africa will normalize back to the era of Trump 1 will be dependent on whether Trump has a successful de-escalation or stabilization effect on global politics, whether the South African economy will again be affected either by risk or opportunity in terms of providing stuff to the world market that is suddenly no longer available from an original source, and whether Trump will factor in the type of predictability that had seen that level of import-export consistency during his first term.
Number one, on what you think Trump in his second incarnation, his administration's second incarnation, what impact will have on US foreign policy and geopolitics, where you now have possibly more of a hand-picked team on his part, those around him quite different from those who were there before, many of whom had tried to really distance themselves from his first administration, and I think in various ways tried to convince voters not to vote for him. So will we see a change, maybe in terms of rhetoric or in terms of action, in terms of what he did in his first administration? And then secondly, your thoughts specifically around some of the biggest risk areas for South Africa with the second Trump administration. When Herman and I chatted this morning, placed more risk on the side of diplomatic relations, where you have the South African government over the last few years moving closer, both in terms of rhetoric and action, to countries like China, Iran. You had the former minister, Naledi Pandor, her last visit to Washington, trying to convince US officials that the African National Congress saw a difference between Hamas as a government versus Hamas as a terrorist organization. These pain points, these sticking points, etc. I know that's quite a bit in two questions, but yeah, your thoughts just on the foreign policy side globally and for South Africa.
So to a certain degree, I think your guess is actually as good as mine in the sense of what will a second Trump term be like in terms of, what sort of policies we're going to get. Trump has said many different things at many different times. One of the things he has said, which there's some legal question as to whether he'll be able to do it without Congress's support, but putting a sort of flat 20% tariff on absolutely every single import into the United States. Will he do that? I don't know. The first Trump administration was, I think, quite a lot of these questions where he would sort of say things, like, we're going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it, being the most famous one. And then that didn't really happen the way it was supposed to. His administration turned out to be far more generic Republican, and in part, I think that was because essentially being largely unprepared for the presidency. He in terms of there was very few people thought he was going to win. In fact, I think he probably wasn't entirely sure whether he was going to win. He didn't have an entire transition plan, and so his administration ended up becoming filled with a lot of very sort of generic, normal Republicans, the sort you would have gotten in any Republican administration. The question is, what will a second one look like? And that's a question we really don't know. Is RFK Jr. going to be in charge of the Food and Drug Administration, as Trump has said? Is Elon Musk going to play a prominent role in his government? Is the Stephen Miller, who is Trump's sort of main go-to on immigration policy, going to be in charge of controlling America's borders? Or is it going to be someone else? Is it going to be some other sort of more normal, generic Republican who gets put into those positions? I think this is all very much open to interpretation right now. And we will have to see what policy does actually come out of a Trump administration down the line. I think Herman was right to highlight unpredictability as being an important feature of this. I suspect the second Trump administration will be more unpredictable than the first, and that means that I'm even less willing to make a firm call on what policies it will pursue. Could be continuity, could be radical change, could be anything in between those two. As for South Africa, I think South Africa got a little bit of an easy ride from the Biden administration, which wasn't particularly interested into getting into some kind of fight with South Africa. The Biden administration, and I think the Democrats in general, feel sort of vaguely warm to South Africa as much as they think about it at all. And while there has been some discomfort with things that particularly the ANC has proposed in the last couple of years, I think generally speaking, Kamala would have continued a very similar sort of approach to Biden, which is mostly ignoring South Africa and kind of avoiding fights when possible. I don't think Trump will be under any such feeling. Indeed, there are many within the Republican Party who have come increasingly to see South Africa as an enemy. There's support. There's support for people who are opposed to expropriation without compensation in the American right. In South Africa, there are lots of anger in both parties, in the pro-Israel caucuses of both, for South Africa's case to the International Criminal Court. And with these forces pushing, Trump will probably fan those flames rather than back away from them. And so, while I don't see anything super serious, I think it's not like, America's going to cut relations with South Africa or anything crazy like that. I do think that South Africa and the Trump administration may have more heated exchanges than a Democratic administration would have.